We're here today with Secretary of Education for Massachusetts, Paul Reville. Thank you very much for coming to the Sun.
My pleasure, Jim. Great to be here.
And I know that you've been a big fan of the Lowell public schools and
Absolutely.
other urban centers, besides all the other many schools you have. But if you could just give us an update, we know that the governor and you have been promoting the readiness school projects, and I saw that there's been legislation filed to lift the cap on
right.
charter schools. Just give us an update on
Sure.
that and how it might impact our own school systems.
Well, as you know, Jim and colleagues, from prior conversations, we announced the Readiness Project in June of 2008, which was a whole set of strategies designed to really open a new chapter in education reform in Massachusetts and make a very aggressive effort toward closing achievement gaps. No sooner have we announced it than we got hit by an economic tsunami, which really seriously impacted our capacity to deliver on some of the strategies. There were over 50 strategies that were mentioned in that package. Nonetheless, we've worked hard over the course of the year to implement some aspects of that work. And two of the signature items on that have dealt with this issue of intervention in chronically underperforming school districts and schools, and how do we promote innovation more broadly across the Commonwealth. And there are lots of opinions on these topics, as you know, and we've been spending some time formulating a package that we could bring forward to the legislature, and we've just announced that. Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan was in town this summer, and together with him we announced a package that we think is the logical sort of culmination and outcome of our readiness work, and at the same time puts us in a very competitive position to go after the $300+ million that are going to be available in the federal government's Race to the Top fund coming up. So there are two pieces.
Is that something that's being acted upon in Congress, or has that already been approved?
Well, it's already been approved, and the Education Department is issuing guidelines, and the President and the Secretary of Education have said repeatedly that states need to make some movement on lifting charter school caps. States need to move more aggressively on issues like struggling schools and underperformance. States need to have an innovation strategy, things of this nature. So this is a major grant application. I mean,
so the state will apply for the grant? Is that how it works?
Yes, the state applies for the grant. There'll be, we don't know yet, it's not clear, but by most estimates there'll be 10 or 12 of these grants nationally to the leading states in the country, a very substantial amount of money. There's about $4 billion available for this purpose, and these states will have an opportunity to enact some transformational kinds of reforms that focus in 4 areas that the federal government is calling for. This is a bit of a digression, but it relates to the legislation. You know, one is on the whole topic of standards and assessments. Another is in the area of longitudinal data systems. The third is in an area of teacher effectiveness. And the fourth has to do with struggling schools and what you're doing about struggling schools. So we're in the process of putting together an application right now. The final guidelines aren't out till sometime in October. The application will probably be due January 1st. But this is a major opportunity for the Commonwealth, particularly coming at a time when we know, looking at not just the FY11 budget, which is going to be extremely challenging, but even getting through this existing year, we're going to face challenges as well. So anyway, back to the legislation. So it comes in two pieces. One that focuses in on intervention in struggling schools and districts, and one which focuses in on innovation. The district strategy that we have in terms of focusing in on underperforming school districts is to lift the cap on charter schools. We call for a lift in the cap from 9% of net school spending to 18%. And we have 3 principles that guide the circumstances under which this would happen. Number one, we refer to this bill as a targeted smart cap piece of legislation. It focuses in on the 10% of Massachusetts school districts, the 10% lowest performing school districts. And within those, it only affects the it only affects those communities that are bumping up against the 9% level, and there's 7 communities that are above 6%. Secondly,
where does Lowell fit in that? Are they in the 10%? there?
I'll give you the full list after.
Lowell is in the 10%. I don't know if Lowell is above the 6%.
I don't know
You
if
know
they're,
that? We should
they're
have
near
that.
that cap, but
We can find that out. So, creating more space by focusing this initiative on the state's lowest performing districts, insisting that these schools serve a demographic population that's similar to the neighborhood in which they locate, and obviously this is going to be composed of high proportions of kids with big achievement gaps, so we're focusing on the neediest kids. And finally, utilizing the services only of proven providers. We're saying these are not situations to come in and try out a new concept and a new team, because these kids are already behind the pace and we can't afford another loss. Let's go with people who we know can get the job done. So where we have proven providers, unfortunately we have a number of them at the Commonwealth, we're going to focus on them.
But how does this, in Lowell's case, just take Lowell for example, and I don't want to interrupt you. I mean, they're making progress, but there's certain subgroups, you know, and I see that are behind. So even though a school is underperforming because subgroups are not doing well, I mean, how would that work in action? Would you come in and focus on those subgroups in the school?
Well, I mean, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has a rubric for determining who's making adequate progress in conjunction with the federal law, in conjunction with our own state accountability system. And those schools that are deemed not making adequate progress, whether it's because of their overall aggregate average or because of lagging behind significantly with some subgroups, might become eligible for the kind of treatment that we're talking about. And in the case of the charter schools, we're not talking about individual schools, we're talking about district performance.
Right.
So averaged across the district, we'd want a place like Lowell to be making progress and closing the gaps between those two groups on average. In any given school it can vary, but on average. And one of our problems in Massachusetts is in terms of education reform and education generally, we have certain advantages in terms of our averages. We've got a lot of high-performing students. We've got a lot of middle class and professional class kids who have a lot of supports, and our averages can carry us. And what we're saying is we need to peel that back and look beneath and say, you know, there are a lot of subgroups that aren't, and if we don't educate them well, they become a burden to the Commonwealth and a lost opportunity in their own personal lives. And to the extent that our Commonwealth depends in the future, I mean, our economic prosperity depends on a well-educated workforce, and really not much else that we have to market here. We're now at the stage where we've got to educate all these children to a reasonably high level. We can't afford to leave some of them behind. And so this is designed to push that. The second provision of it focuses in on individual schools. And we have there are three types of readiness schools. One of them is readiness acceleration schools. And that is part of an overhaul of our state accountability system. We have a 5-level system in descending order. So at level 4, under the readiness school legislation, the school gets pulled out of the district for a very close diagnostic look by the Commissioner of Education, whose powers are considerably enhanced here. The Commissioner has a look at that school and has the opportunity and flexibility to tinker with rules, tools, and supports. In the category of rules, the Commissioner can go in and alter any district rules or any collective bargaining rules that affect or impede in any way the capacity of that school to better serve its children. Secondly, has the capacity to supply critical supports with respect to strengthening curriculum and instruction at the school site. So whether it's curriculum materials, or textbooks, or professional development, or coaches for the teachers, any of that can be supplied in the tools category. And finally, in the area of supports, since many of our underperforming schools have high concentrations of poverty, we're talking about being able to supply some additional support in terms of expanded school time, in terms of health and human services that might be available, in terms of tutorial services, things of this nature. So the Commissioner looks this over in consultation with district authorities. You know, he checks with the superintendent, checks with the school committee, parents, teachers, etc. Then basically gives it back to the district. It says to Lowell, for example, we've changed the operating conditions. We've given you more resources and more flexibility. You have the chance to operate this under a performance contract for a couple of years. We will watch you annually. If you improve performance, more power to you. You keep it and keep working it in that way. If you fail to improve performance, you drop into level 5. In level 5, the assumption is you're not capable of running it as a school district. It's in effect a takeover. It gets handed to a receiver, somebody with a track record of turning around schools with these kinds of kids in them. And that individual or organization gets a 5-year contract in order to do that work. Renewable, well, first of all, annual scrutiny, because there are annual benchmark performance elements to it. And at the end of 5 years, if they've performed under the contract, they get to renew it for another 5 years.
Are there private companies out there that turn around?
There are organizations that are coming into this field, because virtually every state is at the point that we are now, which is we've done a pretty good job of identifying underperformance and diagnosing it, if you will, but not such a good job of prescribing what needs to be done to turn it around. So there are a growing list of providers with some experience with this. We also see this as a way of welcoming some of the more experienced, more effective charter providers in through the back door. This is not a charter cap lift, but irrespective of the cap, a receiver could in effect be a charter school provider. For example, if KIPP School wanted to come into Boston and take over an existing school there. Now, most charter school organizations have not been in the business of school turnaround. They're in the business of starting schools from scratch. But we've talked with some of them, and some of them do have an interest in this, in coming in and taking a population of students. They already have a building, and having a lot of freedom and flexibility otherwise, which the commissioner can create under the readiness acceleration schools, and they can take off and run a school.
Now, you're expecting, I guess, some pushback from the imagine the teachers' unions on this, right?
We are.
Well, some stories about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that now. Let me describe the second piece, and then I'll come back to sort of politics of how this works out. So that's the intervention strategy. One piece, charter school cap lift to focus on districts. A second piece, readiness acceleration schools that go into the accountability system at level 4 and 5 that deal with underperforming schools. Now when you move into the area of innovation, we've long wanted, and you and I have talked about this before, to kind of change the conversation on charter schools because it all boils down to the money when you get to the charter school conversation, with the money staying in the system or going out. The governor and I have challenged the education establishment, if you will, to see if they can come up with the sorts of flexibilities and autonomies that schools need within a district to enable them to compete in serving their students in the way that charter schools purport to serve their students, and to learn the lessons of the best performing charter schools. I mean, that's what we're doing in our cap lift, is we're taking the very strongest charter schools, not all of them, because we're not believers that all of them are uniformly superior, but take the best of the best and apply them to the place in the system where we're weakest. So now we're saying under the Readiness Schools Alliance and Advantage prototypes that you have an opportunity as a school system to redesign and re-engineer and restructure a school. A group of teachers forming into the educational equivalent of a law practice can come forward and ask to have the responsibility to run a school. An outside partner, like a museum, could come in and make a contract with a school committee to run a school. The state colleges have been queuing up for this in their local communities and saying, we'd like to do this. University could do it. I've had private colleges. I've got one private college now talking about a private university, talking about taking over a whole quadrant of one of our major cities and operating that. And the idea would be you have to go through an approval process that goes through the local school committee. And in the case of a conversion school, you've got to get a vote of the faculty at the school, but not a vote from the union. So that the faculty at the school, if they say, well, we're willing to work an extra hour a day in exchange for having the authority to make the key decisions as to how the school operates, that's a deal we want to make. Now, some of our union colleagues feel, well, the district-wide union ought to have a shot at approving that. And if they don't like it, if it doesn't seem to be in the interest of the union or the teachers in the district as a whole, we want to be able to veto it. We're trying to learn the lessons in this approach from the prior attempts to migrate autonomy into the school system, notably the Boston Pilot Schools, Horace Mann Schools, Commonwealth Pilot Schools, and each of those is stalled out in its own way. And so we don't want to give anybody the veto power over what happens. except for people who work at the school site, and then by a vote, or the school committee, and then by a vote, and by a majority vote. So we're putting this up. It's our attempt to sort of spread innovation, to get more players involved in this work of public education, because the challenge we've set for ourselves is so tall. And it's a bold approach to doing it, and naturally this upsets folks in the status quo a fair bit. The unions
think so. I didn't think so.
The unions are seeing this as what they like to characterize as an assault on collective bargaining. In our view, it's not at all as an assault on collective bargaining. It's enhancing the role of teachers and giving teachers more responsibility and more authority, and treating them truly like professionals in some respects for the first time, giving them the responsibility as professionals to make critical decisions affecting a school environment, and for school faculties to have some reasonable autonomy as a faculty to make decisions at that school, irrespective of what the district administration says, irrespective of what the district union says. So we see this as professionalizing, strengthening, growing, developing the profession, making it more attractive to young people who have choices to enter professions in which they do have professional discretion. So we see it as an exciting opening for students. We have others in our field who are worried about the enhanced powers for the Commissioner of Education in terms of underperforming schools. And we're not worried about it. We feel that the longer we let children languish in underperforming schools, the less likely it is that we're ever going to get them educated to the level that we need to have them educated. And shame on us if we don't take advantage of what resources and expertise that we have out there, whether it's charter school providers or a direct intervention by the commissioner to provide additional rules, tools, and supports. Shame on us if we don't act promptly to intervene in those situations.
Is the incentive to professionalize teaching more, give them more responsibility, more decision making, is that any kind of an incentive to the unions? Are unions interested in that at all?
I think it's appealing to members. It's not. It may or may not be appealing to the union. It sort of depends. From the union perspective, I think it depends what the union's role is with respect to this. But we're trying to move away from kind of an old adversarial kind of manufacturing industrial mindset about the interests of labor and management. The assumption that labor and management have antithetical interests, and it's necessarily an oppositional interest and a struggle for a limited pie. And we're trying to reframe the discussion as, the strength of our sector will be our capacity to educate all of our students to high levels. The product in this discussion is student learning, just like the product at General Motors was the automobile. And for a long time, you had unions and management fighting over adult prerogatives. What are you going to be able to tell me to do? How much are you going to pay me? What rights and responsibilities am I going to get in return? We're talking about everything but how do we improve the product. Meanwhile, the world around us is changing and the product isn't up to the competition. In the same way, in education, if we're just talking about the rights and prerogatives and responsibilities and authority of all the adults, we're missing the point, which is really what are we doing collectively to improve student learning, particularly in our mainstream public school systems, which are now facing competition outside and growing public perception that we're not in a sort of 21st century modality here. We're addressing the needs of our students as effectively as we might.
But how do you reward those teachers and faculties and administrators who are high achievers and do well?
Yeah.
I mean, do we still keep the status quo pay system? Everybody gets the same, or?
Well, let me.
I think there was a provision for a merit pay component in the original readiness.
Yes, in the readiness project, that was one of the things that we were asked to look at. Let me come back to that in a minute. In one way, we're addressing it already through the readiness schools legislation. In other words, we think we're rewarding teachers with outstanding initiative by saying to them, we will no longer just treat you as rank and file teachers and sort of batch process you and treat you like industrial laborers in the way we do in many of our school systems, but we're going to give you real professional responsibility and discretion authority, autonomy, along with accountability, because that's the nature of the profession. So we think on the surface of it, that's a reward to begin with. We would like, in the best of all possible worlds, because in the current budgetary environment, we're putting up readiness schools as a cost-neutral proposition. But truly, if I had my druthers here, I would have a pot of money to reward those teachers and others who successfully meet their performance goals. Instead of saying your reward is you get to continue operating the school, which is where we are now, I'd like to have some incentive money there. To the larger question that you raised, Jim, about differentiated pay, we're very interested in that. We've been having a number of conversations over the course of the past year on that topic. There are different ways, if you will, to differentiate pay. We're interested in the idea that you may have to pay teachers more to work in some of our most challenging environments. To take the readiness school example, we frequently find in our lowest performing schools, not surprisingly, high proportions of novice teachers. Senior teachers are bid out of there. They don't want to be there. And particularly as we strengthen accountability, they're more exposed if they're in these kinds of schools. So we may need in our current existing compensation system to think about paying a premium to teachers to attract them to serve in the most challenging environments. And why not? It makes sense. It's the hardest work. Why not pay a premium?
Other states have done it, right?
Yeah, there are states that have moved in that direction, and we're prepared to do that as well. A second kind of differentiation has to do with paying for skill and knowledge. You know, on the open market, just as is the case in higher education, it's also true in K-12 that some teachers are in plentiful supply and others are scarce. And so we may have to wind up paying more for science teachers at the secondary level because they're being hired into other professions and the supply is short than we do for an English teacher at that level. And we're in favor of that kind of an approach. A third thing, and this is something that's come up, and both the President and the Secretary of Education have challenged us to think about this and race to the top, is how do you tie student learning through data to teacher performance and then recognize that through the compensation system? And our view of that is, right now, we don't have sufficiently accurate instruments nor do they cover broadly enough all the teachers within the system for us to make consequential determinative decisions on teacher compensation on the basis of student performance results alone. But to build a model in which you have a much more serious evaluation system than we typically have in education, of looking at teacher performance, observations, professional development activity, work products that get submitted, various indicators of student performance, and move that into sort of an overall indicator of student performance and have a compensation linked to that. We have seen some districts, City of Denver, for example, does this, and have done it well.
And that guy became a senator.
That's true. It's just true.
He instituted that program.
Yeah. So
I think it was Mr.
Bennett was he? Yeah, he was. I don't think he started it, but he presided over the school system while that pro-pop system was going on. So we're exploring those. We don't have legislation on that to submit right now, but I think you'll probably see some elements of that in our Race to the Top application.
Tell us, this is interesting what the union has done in Boston. They took over that school.
Yes.
So then the Globe, maybe you can give us,
yeah.
How did that come about? And is that something you're looking at just as a pilot right now to see?
Yeah, no, we're very encouraged by that. That's exactly what we have in mind, is teachers unions as well as individual teachers taking the responsibility and having the authority to run that environment. That school came out of their negotiations with the Boston Public Schools, BTU, Boston Teachers Unions, negotiations with the Boston Public Schools over pilot schools more generally. They said, well, why shouldn't we as the union have the prerogative to run our own school? It's precisely what we're talking about, is why, we in the recent survey that we did of teaching, conditions of teaching and learning in Massachusetts, where we asked a lot of teachers about key elements and characteristics of the schools in which they taught. One of the chief complaints in those environments that teachers had was, and they said a number of interesting things, including we don't have enough time to do the work that we're asked to do. But another one was we're dissatisfied at fairly high levels, in excess of 50%, with the quality of leadership we have in our individual schools. And so what we're saying is kind of turning that around and issuing the challenge to them. Well, if you don't like the leadership you have at school site, if you're not confident in management, why not step up to the plate and become management yourself? Put together a concept, flesh it out in detail with all the key constituencies in your community. Bring it forward to the faculty in your school, see if you can persuade them. If you can, then move it up to the school committee level and see if you can make it work politically at that level, and if the school committee's policymakers buy it. And this is reconceptualizing the profession in a way that I think some of our best and brightest students who avoid the teaching profession now because there's such limited discretion, it's so bounded and scripted, it's not interesting from a professional prerogative standpoint. That this will make it a more attractive profession as a whole.
That concept, though. Now, just is there any administration? I mean, the teachers serve as the administrators in that. I mean, who calls out school if there's a snowstorm?
Well, I think it's part of the proposal, and each of them have to work in conjunction. They're still part of the school system, so in that specific instance, the superintendent would still call out school. On the other hand, they have, depending on the kind of proposal that they negotiate. In other words, we say, look at critical areas of autonomy, like the budget, how you use the budget, like personnel, how you get personnel, how you develop them, what your HR system is, your curriculum and instruction, your schedule and time. Look at the teacher's contract, look at rules, and all of that becomes part of your proposal. So it isn't automatic that you have autonomy in each of those areas. It's a function of what you propose and what you can, thank you very much, what you can convince colleagues in the school committee that it's a level of freedom that you ought to have to operate the school in the way you want.
It's going to be very interesting.
Interesting to watch.
Yeah. Are you seeing any change in school committee structure? We've had some major issues here with school committees to the point where we're looking at ways to maybe abolish them or find a new way to select them, or because we think they're the roadblock to any real change.
School committees are like schools. You see a lot of variability across the Commonwealth. I know some very good school committees that are quite strong, and there are others that are weak and problematic. There have been experiments, and we probably should have more experiments with the way in which school committees look. I mean, Boston's worked with an appointed committee for some years now, and I personally think there have been some very positive results from that experiment, yet it's still limited to one community. So,
they're the only appointed school committee?
To my knowledge, the only appointed school committee in the state.
I'd be interested to know, where are the strong school committees? Are they in the wealthier communities, or have you seen strong school committees in some of the less affluent?
You see variability in both places. I can think of, and I'm not going to get into naming names here, but I can think of in wealthy communities we have dysfunctional school committees, and there are others in which, let's face it, in some of our wealthy communities where we have adequate resources, you have less diversity in terms of the population, you have more of a community consensus on what the schools need to do, it's an easier job to be a school committee person. And you come into a diverse environment with scarce resources and all kinds of fierce competition between subgroups. It's much more difficult, both for school committees to manage and for superintendents. I mean, the average life of an urban school superintendent is less than 3 years because of the nature and challenges of the politics of urban education. So, I think those are realities that we have to take into account. And so I think the urban environment is more challenging, but I can still think of some very strong urban school committees, just as I can think of lots of instances where the school committees are broken down.
But the appointed model in Boston, okay, that the mayor appoints, is that how that works right now?
That's right.
And then is it approved by the city council, or he just has?
No, there's a nominating committee that through which nominations are screened and then offered to the mayor, and the mayor selects from that a list, and
I think the nominating committee includes union people.
yeah, it's a fairly diverse nominating.
I mean, in these models, even with the readiness schools, and this might be going off on a tangent, I mean, do you look at the governing boards at all? I mean, if they have any, it's easy for us to cast blame on the unions and all this other stuff, but sometimes the leadership also has to be
Absolutely, leadership is critical. It makes all the difference. And so we will look closely at the leadership function. Again, this isn't a state approval process for the most part. I mean, the acceleration schools involve the state, but these other kinds of more innovative alliance and advantage schools get approved at the school committee level. So to some degree, they rely on the discretion and wisdom of the school committee, which in some instances may be scary, in other instances, may be promising. No, I understand. And so I think that we will be issuing as a state a set of rubrics. In other words, how should a school committee, what should a readiness school application include? What kinds of evidence needs to be demonstrated on what sorts of points? What should a school committee take into account as they review these? So we'll be providing some, not only tools to guide the process, but oversight of the process that we hope will ensure some measure of quality control. And incidentally, we already have some schools working on this. So we've made a series of grants around the Commonwealth to 15 communities. There are 22 schools in the process of working on preliminary applications. Now, because some of this, we believe, can be done without the legislation. In other words, school committees for a long time have created theme-based schools or academies within schools or magnet schools in certain neighborhoods. And so a lot of this, or partnerships with, visible partnerships with outside entities, we're trying to make it more systemic and more, legitimize it by giving it a name and creating some structural organizational architecture around it. But we want to promote what have been some exceptional schools that have already been created in some communities.
Just leaving the charters and the readiness project for a second, we've seen a lot of talk about the regional vocational schools, and it seems like now they've become a target for some of the in-district schools, because we know in our area kids have been leaving the public schools to go to these regional schools, and supposedly there's a waiting list of thousands of kids who want to get into it. There's not enough slots. Is there any idea of talking about expanding these vocational schools? Or I know there's a couple that are being built. Aren't they constructed? Isn't there one or two that are new regional vocational schools?
There's some new facilities being built, but for existing schools.
Where do they fit in this scheme of things?
Well, I mean,
it seems like that's become a very attractive educational alternative for a lot of school children or parents, and yet there doesn't seem to be enough. There doesn't seem to be enough seats available right now.
Absolutely, and I'm a parent of one of my stepdaughters in the vocational school, and I'm thrilled with what her experience has been. And just as secretary, or as chairman of the board before that, traveling around the Commonwealth, frequently having an opportunity to go into vocational schools and seeing the level of motivation and sense of purpose students have there, and then looking at the results, the performance results on vocational schools are exceptional. And these were schools, I remember back to the onset of education reform, where in many instances vocational educators themselves were arguing our kids can't meet these standards, and we insisted yes they can and they need to be viable in this 21st century. Yeah, there you go. And sure enough, and I say that every year because I go to these awards ceremonies for the top vocational students we have at Mechanics Hall in Worcester, and I say, this is, to me, it exemplifies the power of high expectations. So I think that, direct answer to your question is, we're not in a position as a Commonwealth to be building new vocational schools right now. The expense of those is significantly higher than mainstream schools, and the cost per pupil is higher, but we're certainly supportive of them and encouraging the development of those programs and expansion where we can within mainstream schools, and asking our mainstream educators to take a look at the vocational schools and the lessons that can be derived from that experience. In other words, there are a lot of lessons about applied learning, what some of us have characterized as 21st century skills. How do you apply skill and knowledge that you've developed to real world problems and make a difference? that animates and excites and motivates kids. And vocational schools are very effective at doing that. If our mainstream educators could take some lessons, take a few pages from the vocational schools book, I think we'd have a stronger mainstream system.
The Pioneer Institute came out with a report this week rating the Lowell middle schools, elementary schools as Ds.
This one?
D.
D.
Yeah, the high school got a B, which seems contradictory. The B system going into it.
Right.
There's been a lot of money spent here by the state, still running the schools with D ratings.
Right. Well, I haven't seen the report, don't know the methodology, and so I would want to see that before commenting on it. I mean, we have a lot of variable performance in school systems all across the Commonwealth, and I think that's the genesis of our legislation, is that we've got to do something more urgently about that. I don't know how helpful it is to continue to have multiple systems for identifying our problems. I think we know what the problems are right now. The real challenge is what do we do about it. And particularly in light of the kind of budget crisis in which we find ourselves, what kinds of strategies are we going to apply to the Lowell Middle School, if that's the case, to turn around that performance? What's the issue? I mean, middle schools, generally speaking, a very high proportion of our underperforming schools statewide happen to be middle schools, and often middle schools in the urban context. So we need to be thinking, I think, less about let's have another system for calling them out for underperformance, and more about what it is exactly that we should be doing about that. What's the problem? I mean, for example, we have, when we look at our underperforming schools statewide, why is it that the overwhelming majority of these schools contain high proportion of kids from backgrounds of poverty? So is the problem the school, or is the problem the poverty? And we need to disaggregate that as we look at it diagnostically, and then as we plan out a treatment, our treatment needs to treat the problem. I've been into and looked at the data on some schools that get characterized as underperforming. They have, let's say, a 75% transiency rate of people moving out each year. If you look at the 25% that they work with over time, you'll see steady improvement, indicating this is a pretty good school where some good teaching is going on. But our indicators show us that it's a poor school. And in reality, the biggest problem this school faces in terms of performance is 75% of the kids are leaving each year.
I'm wondering if here in Lowell, 1,000 kids have gone to a charter school. Are they the best kids that came out of the school now over there, so they're not being measured in that school? That's right.
Well, and of course, charter critics frequently say there's a bias in the selection of charter schools, of people that not only is a function of the charter school itself, which they often do it by lottery, and there really isn't a bias in their process, but even the parents who would choose to select are by definition more activist parents, and more activist parents, that tends to be associated with higher levels of student achievement and so forth. So there are concerns about that.
And it seems your expansion plan tries to address that.
We do.
The charters are expanding where they're most needed.
Well, that's it. We're trying to focus it in the communities where it's most needed, but we're also trying to put pressure on those schools to say, we want you to serve the neediest schools, the neediest kids in this community. And so, for example, there's a provision in that bill that gives the charter schools for the first time access to the addresses of all the students in the district. So they'll have a free shot at recruiting from the entire base of the district, so that they'll be able to send English language learners, for example, recruitment materials in the native language, in the hope of getting them to attend that school. We asked the schools, the proposed charter schools there, to have an enrollment plan that says, how are you going to get an enrollment that looks like the district? Even if you use a lottery, then you're going to have to have a pool that's reflective of the district as a whole. And then, importantly, because this is another one of the criticisms of many charter schools, is how are you going to retain them? How are we going to be assured that you're not pushing out the most challenging students and having the public school system, the mainstream system, be the safety net, and in effect creaming out the back door? So we're trying to build in safeguards and protections against that, and in the hope that we're going to really target this in a smart way to go to the area of our mainstream system in which we're weakest and learn as much as we can from the charter providers who've done the best job.
Do you find that a lot of kids from, say, middle and elementary schools, Catholic schools, other religious schools, then come back to the public schools at the high school level, and that might have an impact on the grading as well?
That sometimes happens. I mean, it's certainly easy enough in a community to analyze that. I mean, I haven't looked at the data in Lowell, but you can see that. You see that phenomenon in other communities, for example, where there are exam schools at the high school level that may not exist as opportunities at the middle school level. You see some of that. Depends on the quality of the high school.
At least giving people opportunity to go to school year-round if they wanted to, especially for the neediest students. They've even set up online programs. Okay, you don't have to physically go to the school. I know Florida has done that, but at least if they need remedial help, they can take online courses and stuff. That seems to me like, especially in Lowell, right when the school year ends, these teachers have worked hard to get these kids up to a certain level. Then they come back in September, they got to go back and give them remedial help because everything they've lost that.
What has Salem's experiment yielded? I mean, they've had year-round for some 15 years now. What has that shown?
Well, it's just in one school there. It's in a particular school, and they've had some good results that have come from that. I think there are a number of things. I mean, Massachusetts, frankly, is one of the lead states in terms of our expanded learning time initiative that's really pushing the boundary there. Now, we offer, interestingly, in that experiment, we offered schools the choice of you get more money for a longer year or a longer day. Without exception, they picked longer day. There are probably reasons, cost-related reasons for doing that, but nonetheless, that's what they've done.
Carla tried to do that here, and then the union voted against it.
I know. I remember that. I was disappointed.
Yeah.
I think that you go to a place like Florida now. They have year-round schooling in Florida, but it's important to know that what they mean is probably not net, or definitely not net more time than we have here. It's distributed differently. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons it happens in Florida, it happens in Arizona and places where they've got burgeoning population. The population is growing so quickly they're not using the facilities as well. They need to use them more year-round. So they're breaking it up. You're 8 weeks on, 4 weeks off, 8 weeks on, 4 weeks off. So you get to 180 days, but you don't have a big gap in the summer. I think, really, I mean, in the long run, given what and I've been on this for a long time, since I was first on the Board of Ed in the early 90s, a chairman then asked me, what did I think was the most important thing that I wanted to work on as a board member? I said, it's this time issue that was embedded in the 93 bill, and I chaired the Commission on Time and Learning in 94 and 95, and then before I took this job, I was chairman of with Chris Gabrielli of the National Center on Time and Learning, and we're trying to build off the Massachusetts experiment in the hope that we get others around the country to replicate that. In fact, it's taking off now. And Senator Kennedy, before he died, had introduced legislation on this topic, and we're hoping in the next reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that there'll be incentives for states to push this. But we're really so far now beyond the model of a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to time in education. We know that some children need much more time and support by virtue of their circumstances. We've got to harness technology to get there because the economic advantages of doing that are significant. We've got to be willing to say different kids need different treatments, and that involves different amounts of time. Overall, in general, for what we're asking schools to do now, get them to proficiency in 7 core subjects, give them a well-rounded education. In our view, give them a suite of what we call 21st century skills that have become demonized in the policy discourse, but are really about the capacity to articulate an oral argument, the capacity to work effectively in teams as we do in most of our workplaces, the capacity to speak a foreign language, the capacity to have a sense of what the international economy is all about and how we fit in, the capacity to apply skills and knowledge to contemporary problems that need solution and be effective. So to do all those things in 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, 15% of a child's waking hours, and to try and do what no school system before us has done, which is to get all of our students to proficiency, it's just unrealistic. So we got an old model that we inherited from more than a century ago, when we needed to batch process and mass produce education for a lot of immigrants, for an urbanizing society, for an industrializing society, and prepare most people to go out into low-skilled, low-knowledge jobs. It was great then, but it just doesn't fit the 21st century anymore.
So we can say today that the Secretary of Education said we should send our kids to school for 11 months a year.
I'm already in trouble over the last set of reforms we did.
No, I know it would take a big infusion of money too, because
Yes,
you'll
it
have
would.
to pay you'll have to pay more, and but I think that would be a solution. And, you know, I've heard from a lot of people in Lowell, social workers and stuff. The school year ends, and that's the last time some of these kids eat breakfast or get a breakfast, because they get the school lunch programs. And then, you know, it's just amazing that the poverty.
Schools should be the hub of our whole system for serving young people in our society. Schooling and beyond schooling and all those services and supports. And it means thinking differently about schooling, and we're pretty conservative about this. It's not just people in the profession, it's not just teachers unions. I mean, if you put up schedule changes at the level of the school committee, people will come out in droves to tell you, parents and families come out in droves. That's the best way to get attendance at a school committee meeting. You know, you bring up an important matter of curriculum instruction, you'll see nobody in the audience. You say, well, we're going to eliminate the February vacation. People will go ballistic. You know, and oh, I've got my summer plans, and oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, oh, you're destroying my child's life. We have a cultural change to make here. I mean, education is a benefit to the individual and to the society. It's one of the few benefits that when you offer it to people, they'll sometimes give you a double take and say, why are you picking on me? Why are you discriminating against me and saying I have to do more school here? We view it in some respects as a negative when it's an asset.
You know what drew the largest crowd this year to a school committee meeting?
What's that?
When they had a proposal to have frozen food brought into the school lunch program.
Well, there you go.
You know, that's what attracted the biggest crowd.
That's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
But
Led to charges.
Yeah,
As a school board member.
yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. Well,
What do you
we often
hear-
get distracted. I know the media doesn't contribute to that in any way, but it just happens indigenously.
Now, what have you heard? We had Commissioner Chester was in, and he really liked what Lowell was doing with the professional development program and some of those other things. These were a report. Was there, Jen, a report that came out and said they were doing very well in that regard? Have you heard anything?
Yeah, I haven't so much on the professional development, but I know I was very impressed last time I was up here on this kind of partnership with higher education and with the business community, and focus on preparing people to be successful in graduating so that they were college and career ready. That kind of emphasis that the new superintendent has brought, I think, has been very strong, and I was impressed at the level of outreach that has gone on in the community and the number of people who are around the table and ready to work on that. So I've long been impressed with what's going on in Lowell. You've got a very diverse school system. You've got a changing population. You've had some strong leadership over the years, and I think there's enormous potential there. At the same time, I think there are enormous challenges. Having a very large high school the way you have is challenging to make that situation work, and and transiency and turnover are a big challenge, I know, in the community as well. But I had a chance, several years ago, I had a chance to go to Cambodia, actually, with a group of Lowell educators who were part of a larger group of teachers that were on a visit over there. Just very impressed at the level of dedication and sincerity and interest. Those teachers wound up meeting some of their students over in Cambodia, and the level of personal connection and commitment there was very, very impressive.
One of the we've been advocating regionalization, but to a point. Now we've had one superintendent, Superintendent Marshall from the North Middlesex Regional School District. That this school district agreed with
They've
the
gone into a
Quabbin.
sharing.
They've gone into a sharing. Okay, but the school districts are 40 miles away.
Yeah, that's a long way away.
Yeah. Now, is that going? Do you see that as a trend and as a good?
Yes, we're definitely trying to promote that kind of. I mean, we've got to look for
They're 40
efficiencies.
miles apart.
I know. Well, but you still. I mean, there are things that you can do in the virtual world, like purchasing and offering collaborative programs that even at that distance, I mean, we pay, for example, enormous amounts of money to bus special education students to the four corners of the state to receive special services in special schools that if a couple of districts got together and pooled their resources, they could offer more cheaply at some point 20 miles from each district and still save tens of thousands of dollars over what they're paying sending somebody out individually. So we're a believer that we've got too many school districts operating in isolation, and not all of them are both effective from an educational standpoint and efficient from an economic standpoint. And yet this is an inherited way of doing business in New England. If you look at another state like Maryland, they have a comparable population to ours. They've got 24 school districts. And we have, on paper, 390 some school districts. So, and we've got a declining student population. So, but of course this is very hard fought territory. So we're trying to encourage at one end to create some incentives and encourage the kind of collaborative behavior that you're talking about, the existence or the development of these regional collaboratives that do things like joint programming for professional development, for special education, for various kinds of services that smaller districts can't afford to mount on their own. They do the joint purchasing and various kinds of technology services and things of that nature. So that's one end, and at the opposite, more controversial end of the spectrum is pushing consolidation. And we are going to have a bill in this regard coming forward sometime in the next 6 months or so that will speak to this set of issues.
Any other questions? Well, Paul, thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you for being here, and I especially appreciate the attention to the legislation coming up. We think that what we're presenting is kind of the opening salvo in what will be a campaign for a next generation of education reform in Massachusetts. We have long been recognized as a national leader in the area of elementary and secondary education, but others are stepping up, and we need to step up and indicate we're willing to take bold transformational action. We think that's what's embodied in our legislative package. We appreciate your interest in it.